Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. I really appreciate that. And hopefully you will enjoy what we're doing tonight and want to try this recipe yourselves. I welcome questions, comments, anything. I want this to be as interactive as possible. There are times when I'll actually have you come up and help with the cooking. Not tonight, however, but coming up in the next couple of months for sure, we will be doing that, okay? So you'll want to check the calendar here at the library and see what's coming up. I'm Kelly Moore. I'm with the Missoula County Extension and MSU Extension. Has anybody ever heard of MSU Extension? Or, okay, great. Some people say, what does that mean? Just means extension as we go out to the communities we're located in most counties. And I'm the family and consumer science person. So we have a lot of different programs. This is one of my favorite ones for cooking. I have a background in, I had a catering company for a while, did a lot of cooking, so one of my favorite things to do for sure. So tonight we are going to do beef Bourguignon, and if you are a French major or speak it well, please tell me, because I know I didn't pronounce it correctly. But anyway, it's pretty much means like a beef stew, and it is a French word. Has anybody ever tried it or heard of it before, or familiar with it? No, serious. Yeah, so hello, welcome. So it's actually kind of like a beef stew, only there are a few different ingredients that you might be surprised at tonight that we're going to add. I always like to talk about food history, and I think that just makes it more fun to eat the food that you eat, knowing what the background is. So it originated in the Burgundy region of France, between Lyon and Paris. And of course, France is pretty famous for wines. And a Burgundy wine is kind of part of the ingredient that goes in this dish. The other part, well, and we'll go through each ingredient and talk about it briefly. Obviously, there is some beef, since that's the title of the what we're making. But there are so many different recipes, and we're going to find out too what the difference in recipes and why we have so many of them. So you don't have to go to Paris or France just to taste this recipe. You can make it on your own. It was originally started for people who just had some simple ingredients, wanted to put it together, make it taste good, something they could cook at home in all day if necessary. So there are a few things I'd like to talk about before we start cooking. We want to talk about the recipe, the equipment, the technique that's needed, and the time. These are all considerations before you start to make something. Do any of you have like a favorite cookbook or something? Have you written your own cookbook? I mean, what's the experience out there? Do you? Okay, well, and that's the wonderful thing about this library, to have such a great selection of cookbooks. And I would just like to come and sit someday and start looking through all of them. They do have a lot of my favorites. One tonight is here. You would be able to check out. I'll show you which one we're going to be using. So when I start to look for a recipe, I make a lot of things up, and that's okay. But if it doesn't turn out well, then yeah, you have to kind of start all over. Or if somebody doesn't like it, or if I don't write it down. So that's the nice thing about a recipe. You have consistency. You can go to the store, look at each ingredient and say, okay, I need this, this, this. And sometimes when you're making things up at home, I think, oh, I don't have that, so it's not going to taste the same. A lot of times, too, you want to think about who you're cooking for. Is it appropriate for the group you're cooking for? And again, I'll tell you in a few minutes why I asked that question. Can you find the ingredients? We're lucky in Missoula, too, to have a lot of great stores. It doesn't have to be all organic. I like to use organic. I like to use garden fresh things. But in December, that's hard to do, isn't it? Yeah. So, sometimes you can use things that are in the freezer. That's okay too. What is your budget? I mean, this recipe has beef. Beef is not actually a cheap ingredient. And the recipe we're using tonight uses maybe a little bit more expensive cut of beef because it's faster in this recipe. And also, there is a vegetarian option. People have used mushrooms before, and I've heard that's a great tasting recipe. This is not low calorie, so this isn't something when you're on a diet you want to eat. There's a lot of fat is flavor, like they always say. There's a lot of that in here. So that's why it's kind of a special dish that you might make around the holidays. We have it a lot around Christmas. So let's see, what else? Yeah, for the different techniques, do you want to spend the time doing it? And how many people you're cooking it for? I made this for, let's see, I think 200 people before when I was doing catering, and that's a lot of prep time. And but they liked it. It was a big roaster pan I put it in. It's something that could cook all day, or the version we're making is faster. So there are those two options. Let's see. So I would like to too just kind of go through the different things that we're going to be using tonight. First of all, let's start with the books. If you're going to use a recipe, of course. Has anybody ever heard of Julia Child? Maybe you saw the movie. Yeah. So this is one of her cookbooks. Her recipes are pretty amazing, but you have to have an awful lot of time to go through them. They're very, very detailed. And just like the movie, if you ever saw that, somebody who took a year to do each one of these recipes. And if you don't have that time, don't want to do that right now, then I'm going to take it out of this one. This is Ina Garten. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She has a couple of TV shows. I like her recipes. I used them a lot in catering, and I'm going to give her all the credit. This was not something I made up. Her recipes are easy to read. This one is filet of beef Bourguignon, which just means the meat's a little more tender. There's a little more fat to it. It's faster cooking. And usually if people use a stew meat, that's going to take a long time because the meat's tougher cut. It's a cheaper cut, but you get a lot of flavor out of it by cooking it longer in the sauce. So this is the one we're going to use tonight. But if you ever get and look in this book and you make it, please come and talk to me because I want to hear how that all went. And I think that would be fun to do. We're also, let's see. Let's just get started with what else we're going to put in there. We'll talk about equipment and the ingredients. So, mushrooms. So when you get the mushrooms, they're kind of what? Kind of dirty looking, aren't they? So a lot of people just run them under the faucet. Does anybody do that to wash them off? Okay, and that's okay. But a better way, if you're cooking something, because they're made of a lot of moisture anyway, I usually just take a paper towel, a wet paper towel, and kind of just wipe them off. So you're just kind of giving them a little bit of a sponge bath here, get all that dirt off, and then you haven't added water. So you can use any kind of mushroom you want in this. Cremini I've used already. Always when we do this, I have to make one ahead because it takes so long. And then we'll just kind of get this one started with the fresh ingredients. This recipe also calls for pearl onions. Anybody ever use those for anything familiar? Okay. You can get them frozen, and those are just as good. But I thought it might be fun to look for the fresh ones. So I did find them. They were a big bag. This is kind of the label, and they look like this. Yes?
What's the difference between pearl onion and regular onion?
It's a little bit different flavor, but a lot of it in this recipe is just for looks, because it looks nice to have little onions in there, yeah. But for these, you don't just cut them like you do regular onion. You have to boil these for a little bit, not very long, just about 3-4 minutes. Then you put them in an ice bath, and then they just pop right out of their skins. And then you can put them in the recipe. And when you taste it, you can let me know they're worth all that trouble, but they do look nice. We're gonna use garlic. I love using garlic. You could use the garlic in the jar, but I like this better because I love to smash garlic. I could do that all day long. It's a good stress reliever for me. So we'll do that in a few minutes. I like to use fresh herbs when I can. There's some thyme. You can use the thyme that's dried, that's fine. You might, it's a little bit stronger flavor when you use the dried thyme, but this, it smells good too. And easy to grow in your gardens. Let's see, carrots, use the carrots. I like to leave the peel on the carrot because that's a lot of vitamins, nutrition in there, but I do wash the carrot off. And now we'll start talking about equipment. Like this little thing is so handy for me because I can just brush off the carrots and feel like they're not dirty. And you might say, well, nobody's going to know once they're in there, but I like to know that they're cleaned off. So I'll do that before we cut those. Beef broth. I tend to like to use the liquid kind. Again, it doesn't have to be organic. I just typically get that. They just recommend in this recipe you don't use the cubes. There's just not as much flavor there. If you make your own beef broth, wow, that's impressive and that's wonderful. Even better flavor. But tonight, for convenience, we'll use that. I like to use this tomato paste in a tube. So it looks like, yeah, you can just brush your teeth with tomato paste, but it lasts a long time. And sometimes, you know how you get a can of tomato paste, you use one spoonful of it, and then, okay, what do you do? I mean, you can freeze it, what's left over, but this is convenient for me. Let's see, this recipe also has, of course, a couple of different types of meat. We do have bacon, because bacon's always good for flavor. I have this, and we will be cutting that shortly. The beef I'm using is, let's see, this is a beef loin tri-tip. So it's more like a steak, and it's kind of cut that way, a long piece. That came from Costco, just because I can get a lot more, and I typically buy a lot more. Okay, so, but you can get it any place. If you buy stewed meat, fine, but it's just gonna take longer to cook. And I'll show you how we're gonna prepare that in a few minutes as well. We're gonna use a little butter and flour. I'll show you how we're gonna mix that. I always use, or tend to use, olive oil. You can use another type of oil if you want. Make sure that something's got a pretty good heat point that's not going to burn easily. Sometimes well, this time I will add a little bit of butter, as if we didn't have enough flavor already, but that's okay. This is all about indulging yourself, a special meal. Let's see, what else? Oh, and a couple other ingredients, because this is a French recipe, so, which calls for wine. So, but you don't have to worry because it cooks out. The way we do it, it's going to cook out the flavor. A lot of recipes also have cognac in them, which is a pretty typical French ingredient. You can, when you pour this in the pot, it gets very hot, you can light it. That burns off all the alcohol, which is very impressive, but I didn't think we should be having open flame in the library. So that one is optional. The wine you just use pretty much, doesn't have to be an expensive bottle of wine, but like I was saying, if you want to use a wine that tastes good in your recipe, you want to be able to drink it as well, and it's good for both. Okay, and again, a little salt and pepper, and that's basically it. It's really pretty easy ingredients, and the thing is just cooking it to let the flavors all come together. Let's see, what else have I forgotten? Think any of that. I think we might be ready to get started. Our equipment, this is like one of my prized possessions. I will never go anyplace without my pot. And this is the La Crusade, but I mean, they have a lot of pots. It doesn't have to be that name. And it's been used a lot because you can see kind of but it's very heavy cast iron, and it really does retain the heat. it's great for putting in the oven. It can cook something for hours and never burn. So, and because of this induction heat top, I have to use cast iron or a special pan with, you know, the magnetic thing on the bottom. So we're going to use this today. So we'll get started here. We already have some made, so you will be able to taste it soon. So another thing with the bacon, this is another good thing to have kitchen shears. But if somebody in your house grabs these and takes it to cut paper, like in my house, so I almost have to lock these up. These are only used for cooking, okay? All right. So, and also measuring things, that's important too if you want to maintain the consistency of flavor. If you get to the point you just want to wing it, experiment, but you know, make sure you have plenty of time. So, in case you have to redo it for any reason. Okay, so we are going to get started. We're going to saute the beef a little bit. Let's see if we can get it where everybody can see. And if you need to step up closer, please do that. You're welcome to do that. I'm going to put a little bit of olive oil in this pan here. Doesn't take too much. All right, and then we're going to see if we can get this going. This recipe, basically the entire time to prepare it is probably about an hour. If you were to do the more stew version with kind of more stew meat or chuck roast, you better plan on a couple of hours easily, 3 hours for it to cook in the oven. Okay, let's see. All right, so while we're getting that ready to heat up, it does take some time because it is cast iron. So we're going to do some of the other prep here. I'll try to get this around so everybody can see. Again, let's see, we're going to cut that bacon first to kind of get it out of the way. If you're making a full recipe, I think I use like 3 strips of bacon. I like to use the thick cut because the other kind is just so, tends to be a little more fat and you don't get the same flavor. So I'm just going to take these instead of using the scissors. And bacon's a lot of flavor too. So you're going to get that bacon fat in there as well. And that's going to all add to the other things that we're going to put in there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stick that in there, kind of get started. That doesn't take too long to cook, so we're going to let that have the first go around in there. Once this gets hot, I mean, things will burn pretty fast, so you do have to keep an eye on it. While that's cooking, I'm going to take this, let's use the same tongs. Probably in this recipe that you have the copy of, she probably uses a larger piece of meat because it's like actually a fillet. But this was a pretty decent price. There's a lot of good fat marbling in there. So I'm just going to kind of cut pieces. And you can tell it's pretty tender already because this knife works. Plus the knife is sharp, that helps too. So I'm not cutting it in tiny little pieces like it's soup. Because you want it to be a little bit bigger chunk. Because you're actually going to cook this where it's still a little rare inside. Yes? Well, that's a really good question. I think it's just trust where you go to buy it, you know, that you, I mean, again, you want to make sure that, like if there's some fat marbling in there, it's going to be more tender. If you buy a very lean piece of beef or meat, it's going to dry up fast and it's going to be kind of tough. Yeah. Let's see, well, Costco, because I buy a lot of things here in bulk. So I tend to have really good luck there. Not that I'm trying to promote anybody again. I used to get a lot of meat at Rosar's, like the butcher. area. If you know a good butcher, and I don't know if do we have that butcher shop anymore? I know one closed down. Yeah, it did. So if we ever do get another, yeah, that's a good place to go. Just or know the people that you're buying from. If it's not something you like, then you can take it back. And yeah, usually they're pretty knowledgeable about that. So, oh, thank you. Yeah. And there are some organic stores in town, so if you're sensitive or you want to know what's in your food or whatever, it's going to cost a little bit more, but it all comes down to preference. Yeah. And truly, in this one, there's so many different flavors. I mean, you will know if the beef isn't good, but there are other ways to kind of mask it because you have a lot more stuff going on in here. Okay. So I think when that's cooking, I'm going to go ahead and smash these garlic while we're waiting here. We will cut the carrots here. Okay. So notice I am not a very organized cook because I like things to be all around. So here we go, smashing some garlic. Garlic burns very easily, so we don't put that in until the very last. There's kind of a bad spot on there. Yeah, if there's like this brown spot on your garlic, I usually don't cook that. I kind of set that aside, and that's the nice thing about garlic. You got a whole lot of choices there. Off that end, and so I'm just gonna, there's so many different ways you can smash garlic, and it does have different flavors that relate to the way it's cut, but I'm just gonna mince it up a little bit. I mean, I know a lot of people just eat it raw, which you can usually tell who those people are. Stays around a little bit, but I mean, it's to be good for you. And sometimes I'll just take a whole bulb like this, cut off the top, and wrap it up and just roast it in the oven, which makes great garlic butter. All right. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead, whoops, I'm gonna turn this down a little bit. Every time I use this thing, I'm always learning as to what is high and what's too low. Okay. So in this recipe, you don't have like just chopped up onions. The only onions you're going to have are those little white ones. And in a few minutes, we're going to deglaze the pan. Does everybody know what deglazing means? Okay. And you're welcome to come up here and look in here if you want. Yeah, don't feel like you. Oh, that's true. That's what that's up there for, isn't it? I forget about that. Oh. So I'm going to leave that in there. Deglazing, you have all that flavor in there from a little bit browning going on in there. So when you pour another liquid in there and stir it all together, that's what it's called. You're kind of scraping up all the bits in the bottom, which is the flavor. And guess what we're going to deglaze with? With wine. We're going to use wine, yes. And that's what adds all that good flavor. Okay. Yeah, can you smell that? It's pretty garlicky, isn't it? Okay, so this out here. Yeah, there's kind of different steps in putting this together, but it all ends up in the same pot eventually here. I'm going to grab another bowl here so we can actually put that in there. Okay. Now, of course, the wine and the cognac will taste completely different, but together, they're good too. They're just added at different times in your recipe. Okay. Make sure this is high enough. Because it's really got to be pretty hot. You got to hear it like bubbling in there before you add the wine. Okay. While that's getting a little bit hotter, I'm just going to kind of rinse these off really quick. Yeah, and this recipe too, because it's all supposed to kind of be around the same size chunks and look nice. I've had somebody ask me before, can't you use those little baby carrots? Because they're so convenient, they're already cut. But in this recipe, I'd say probably you won't get the same result because these actually look nice, just cut in chunks. And they cook pretty fast. So I would save those for your dip plate instead. Okay. All right, I think those are pretty well brown. So if there was a lot of bacon grease in there, which there doesn't seem to be a whole lot more than what we need. Okay. So I would typically take a little bit out if it's too much, but I think that's going to be just fine in there. Okay. All right, yep, the garlic's just perfect. So I'm going to kind of scoop that out before we put the wine in. And you know what we might do, because the pan is so hot, I think I'm going to go ahead and put the bean in there to brown it. Then I will do the glazing. So I'm going to just put a little bit of salt and pepper, which I forgot on those two pieces. Of course, we'd use a whole lot more beef than this if we were making a big pot like we already did. So I think it calls for 3 pounds. Make sure that they're all spread far enough apart so they're getting a little bit of a brown crust on them. Right here. Like I said, there's so many things that go in this recipe. It's good to have everything you need out already. So it's a little bit faster. While I'm letting that brown some, I'm going to just wipe off a few more mushrooms here. So we're ready to go. Somebody asked me, well, what if you don't like mushrooms? Can you leave them out? I always say just pick them out because they do add some flavor and they look nice in there. So they do take on the flavor of the other things. Sometimes I will take the bottoms off. You don't have to, but they're a little bit tough occasionally. You can save them for something else, chop them up, because I'm just going to have the mushrooms. Okay. You don't usually need a whole container worth. Okay, that's probably enough of those for now. So we're going to check this and see. So that's kind of getting a little bit of a crust on there. We say you don't want it to be cooked all the way through because you end up putting it back in the oven to cook a while. So, oops. Right. Still pretty hot there. I'm going to go ahead and measure out our wine. This actually is about a half of a recipe from what you would normally do. But since we already have it made, that's what I had left. So anybody have any questions so far? Comments? Anything? Okay. What's that? Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's something about something cooking in a big pot. Yeah, it smells good. All right. That will be ready shortly. I'm going to go ahead and slice these vegetables. So I'm just going to cut the ends off. Already did that on these. Okay. And then what I just usually do is kind of a diagonal, so kind of a chunk. So they actually look better that way. That piece is just not as nice looking there. So what's typically in a stew, which might be potatoes, that's the one thing that's missing in here. So, okay, so usually when it's kind of brown on both sides, and again, it's not going to be cooked all the way through yet, it's still kind of rare, but once you put in the really hot sauce and cook it for another half hour, it's going to be just perfect. Okay. So we're going to set this aside. And now we got a whole lot more good stuff in there. All right. Okay, so get ready for a little bit of steam here. And we're just going to let it boil a little bit, because if we were just to throw things back in there, if you were to taste it right now, it would be really very strong wine flavor. So you want a little bit of that alcohol to burn off, okay? It's later on, we will just add a little bit of that cognac. It's not required in this recipe, but it does add a lot of nice flavor. We're going to add some thyme too. A lot of people, when they do this recipe, they'll just drop this whole thing in. I like to chop up a little bit of it. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and put the carrots in here because that's all going to go in there together. And then we'll chop up a little bit of thyme. So the way to get these leaves off, you just kind of pull it all the way down like that. It just strips the little stick there. So, I know there are a lot of varieties of thyme too. There's like a lemon thyme. I don't think that would hurt to put that in here, but okay, that should be plenty right there. Just chop that really finely. throw that in there. Yeah, we're just going to add about a tablespoon of that. Not too much. Okay. Now, it's really reduced a lot, as you can see. So now we're going to be ready to add the beef broth. And we're going to put the carrots in there with the meat and our bacon and garlic. And for the mushrooms, I usually just cut those in half and add those in. And of course, if I had saved out the onions, I'd be throwing those in there too. But you get to see what they look like. And they have one that's already made. Okay. And so at this point, I think you have to cook it for, let's see, probably about half hour. I think that's what I did earlier. Let's see. Calls for about a tablespoon of tomato paste. So I'm just going to cut a gas there, squeeze it out of there, no mess. And then there's one last step, but we're going to let this cook down for a little bit first, okay? It's time to clean some of this up. That's when I'm going to put the lid on. Okay, any questions, comments so far?
Looks great.
Okay, good. Well, I also like to serve like a little bit of bread. So this is like a sourdough bread. So you can dip it into the gravy because that's the good part too. You'll have a lot of good sauce. Put it over there. All right. Let's see. Clean up our workspace so you can see. So I noticed too in the Julia Child recipe, it calls for bacon lardons, Lardons. So I didn't know for sure what that meant. That was kind of a new word for me. So I guess it's a piece of bacon that has a little more fat content to it. So it would typically be a little thicker cut of bacon. Because fat is the key to making flavor. So you want fatty bacon, but a thicker cut. What's that? Why is fat flavor? Well, that's a good question. If I could answer scientifically, but yeah, yes, yes, and that is a good. I love her recipes. She's also on Netflix to watch her show. It's very good. Yeah. So, but yeah, again, if you just cook with, cook with something. It doesn't have to be an animal fat either. But, well, I guess butter is still an animal fat, isn't it? But just, what's the difference between having butter on your toast and not? That's kind of a good example. And, there's nothing wrong with toast without butter, but I think it tastes a whole lot better with butter, yeah. So, it's just one of those things. But, again, it's something you have to kind of watch. You don't want to overdo it. It's not like you're going to have it all day long, every day, but, yeah, for certain times it's nice. Well, I believe the fat itself is some flavor, because obviously whatever source it came from, But if we're talking about certain oils to cook with, although the fat content's different in all the oils, I mean, olive oil has a great flavor too, and I use it a lot. But it just depends on what you're using it for. So, yeah. So, okay. I'll show you this part too. At the end, usually, if you're making a roux or something, you want to thicken the sauce. What do you usually use? Flour. Yeah, a little flour. A roux is like a thickener. You have to have, and having grown up in the South, I mean, everybody knows what that is there, but not as much here. If you are making like a gravy or a sauce, usually of any kind, you start out with, again, a source of fat. You can use flour, something that thickens it up. Some people use cornstarch, a combination of flour and cornstarch, and a liquid. So that's the basis of a lot of foods that you want to have flavor in a thicker sauce. So this recipe calls for butter, so one more great flavor. The recipe, I think, calls for 3 tablespoons, 2 tablespoons of flour. So instead of just, cooking this butter down and getting it to melt, we're going to mix the flour with it. Sometimes if you're just adding flour, like for making gravy, you can get lumps in there, right? Because the flour, the starch kind of just balls up and makes a lot of lumps. So to prevent that, we're going to add the flour to the butter, just like that. And then we're going to take a fork and we're just going to smash it in. Right, smashing. And you can do this for a lot of different foods to add the flavor and thicken it. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. One of the ways to do it, yeah. So, and not to say, that eating that way all the time was the healthiest, but it sure tasted really great. I have a lot of good memories from all that. Okay, so just want to incorporate all the flour into the butter. So that will make sure that you don't have lumps in anything. You want to strain things through to get out the lumps. But like I said, this would be the very last stage in this sauce. See, it is boiling right now. And you still want the meat to be not overcooked because it's a more tender kind of meat. The recipe calls for leaving it pretty rare. But, okay. And of course, whenever you're cooking, it's really important you take a taste now and then, right? Just to make sure. So, let me turn this down just a little bit. And this is a good time where you need to add more seasoning. Okay. We do need a little bit more seasoning. You can also get too much salt. You don't need that much salt, but just a little bit more. You can really taste that good the wine flavor and the cognac, but it's not like overpowering. It's just very nice. I like this recipe too because you don't add a whole lot of stuff in there to kind of make it, I don't know, it's just very simple flavor. I'm going to float a few of these in there because I can taste the thyme, but not as much as I like to. And then we'll just fish it out when we're all done. So basically, the most expensive part of this menu would be the beef, wine, unless you have it. So you have to have that expense as well. But the rest of the things are very typically things you would have already. I actually put mine in the oven too. after I had boiled it for like 20 minutes and thickened it, I just put it back in the oven to kind of cook for another half hour. So, and that's what I'm going to take out for you now. Wow, this is a big reach back here to the oven. But somebody's supposed to be handing you things out of there, right? Like in the cooking shows. This ran over a little bit. I'm going to put that in a different container. This was not the serving dish I was going to use, so I just had a little leak on the way over. So there are the little onions. Sometimes I've seen people serve this like over mashed potatoes, which would be neat. So I like it in that there's still a lot of the juice. It's not so thick and then it's hard to get out of there. And then again, I would just put maybe a little bit of thyme on the top just to kind of decorate. About this too, if you were to make it one day and even serve it the next day, it's going to have a whole lot better flavor. Just kind of, that's the way it works. So don't be afraid to make it ahead of time. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of this butter in here to kind of get But if you want it to be, it's still pretty, pretty liquidy. If you want it to be a little bit thicker, like I say, I just put it in the oven for a little while. But basically that's it. It's just a very simple recipe that people can get the ingredients easily. If you see fancier versions, then that's not as authentic. But right. So at this point, I'm going to turn this down a little bit so it can just kind of simmer. All right. And while we're waiting for that to cook a little bit, I'm going to invite you to come up and have a taste of this. If you want to look at cookbooks a little bit, I'll continue that. And it'd be hard to eat meat with a spoon, I realize that. I don't know why I do if you think it needs a little bit more salt, pepper, but whatever. I'm always open to